This week we talk about the emergence of Titus Young for the Lions, the crazy role that Josh Freeman has been on. We talk about what you should do with Cam Newton for the rest of the year, and we compare a couple of AFC West running backs. Then we make some bold predictions that are actually pretty topical this week. So without further ado, let's find out how it all works.
You know how this works.
I do know how it works. It's all about me. And so I want to start talking about me again. I traded Matt Stafford last week.
How did that go for you, AJ?
Well, I felt pretty good about it because the man couldn't throw for more than one touchdown pass, and he couldn't get the ball to Calvin Johnson consistently. And I thought, hey, now's a great time to trade him because I got a lot of pieces for him. And then he had 4 touchdown passes, and I'm pretty bitter about it.
Yeah, as you should be, I assume. But so why did you decide to trade Matthew Stafford, AJ?
Well, and here's the thing. You know I'm a huge fan of Matthew Stafford.
Of the Lions.
Of the Lions. I actually do like the Lions for whatever reason, and I think it's because they have that same kinship as Redskins fans and that tortured fan base. And for many years they've been, I mean, let's be honest, the Lions have been worse than the Redskins for a while, but I still feel for their team and their fans. And so when they got a couple good players, for whatever reason, I was naturally kind of felt like I was bonded to them in some way. And it also helps when Matt Stafford and Calvin Johnson lead your team to the fantasy championship game.
Sure.
But I got rid of Stafford because he just wasn't the guy he was last year, and he wasn't throwing touchdown passes, and that's the big thing. And in our league, touchdown passes from your quarterback is a huge score because they're 6 points, and he just wasn't doing it. So I gave him up. I filled out a running back position, and I filled out a wide receiver 1 position, and got rid of some garbage on my team. So I felt good about it. And then, of course, I think, maybe I offended him or something, but he went out there, had a huge day. Would have had 40 points if he didn't throw that 1 pick. But, 4 touchdown passes. He looked great.
So tell me this. You said he had 4 touchdown passes this week, and I didn't pay as much attention to that game as some of the other ones. You said he had 4 touchdown passes last week?
Yes.
That equals half of Matthew Stafford's season touchdown total. So I don't blame you at all for trading him when you did. We're into week 9 now in the NFL, so we're at the halfway point in the season. You're averaging less than a touchdown pass a game as a quarterback, and that just doesn't cut it. A lot of yards, but also a lot of interceptions too, because he had 1 there. So that means in his first 7 games he had 6 interceptions.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't blame you for trading him at that point. I don't blame anybody for trading Matthew Stafford at that point because of how his season's been going. But that's just kind of what you have to deal with. You have to cope with the fact that he is going to blow up afterwards. And
yeah, I mean, listen, he's a good quarterback in the NFL. He just hasn't been good. And I have to correct that stat. He had 3 passing touchdowns, but he had the rushing touchdown.
Okay, sure.
He's had 3 rushing touchdowns this year, which has been kind of weird for him because he's not really a scrambling quarterback. But yeah, I mean, look, he's Matt Stafford. He's going to have big games. I think I was just most surprised it came against that Seattle defense.
Yeah.
Because their corners they have really big corners, and they're really athletic, and they're really tough, and they did a great job on Calvin Johnson. But that's the thing, I think, is that with this Nate Burleson injury, I think that might be the best thing to happen to Stafford because the guy who's on your team, I think he's on your bench this week, Titus Young, has come out of nowhere here. And, he had a really slow start to the season, but he has looked great in recent weeks. He's had back-to-back really nice weeks, and I think he's going to take a lot of pressure off of Calvin Johnson, force people to not leave him in single coverage. Titus Young was in single coverage on every snap against the Seahawks.
Yes. And I do want to, so Titus Young did come out of nowhere. He was a preseason sleeper kind of guy that they thought might be good, but it was really a toss-up. It was a coin flip. Who's going to be the guy in Detroit? Is it going to be Titus Young or is it going to be Nate Burleson? And I think even Detroit wasn't sure who it was going to be for a little while. Titus Young was staying. He had points in every game, but he stayed in the single digits, except for week 3 against Tennessee, which is a really bad team we know, where he had almost 17 points at 16.5 points that week, but then kind of died off again. What's surprising to me is that Nate Burleson got injured last week I'm sorry, last week was the Seattle week. 2 weeks ago against Chicago, which Titus Young put up double-digit points. And that's Chicago. It was a really good team, really good defense, really good team. And that was a low-scoring game. They only scored 1 touchdown, and that was him. Then you go to this past week, and he had a much bigger game against Seattle. Again, great corners, a really good defense. I will say, though, that means he's only got 3 double-digit games, and 2 of them were in the last 2 weeks. Now, again, that was Burleson's injury playing into that, and then had 3 or less points in all other games. So I think you've got a 2-week run right now with Burleson out. I do want to see it for at least another couple weeks and see, and we're getting to the point in fantasy football where we're way past the halfway point and almost to where playoff seeding is starting to be decided. So there's not too much time you can wait, but I will say that if you can get Titus Young still, or if you have him, hang on to him. Maybe even consider starting him. I'm considering starting him this week because he's actually doesn't have too bad of a schedule ahead. He's got 2 games against Green Bay, which should have a ton of passing. With Charles Woodson out, they're not as good. Their passing defense isn't as good. Arizona's a tough pass D, but Calvin Johnson will draw Patrick Peterson, so he should still get open a lot. And then they play Houston, which is another good defense, and then they play Chicago, but that's not until fantasy is over, so that's not even a relevant game.
Yeah. Here's a thing also about that Week 3 game against Tennessee, and I just did this real quick to see what Burleson did. That was that really freaky game where they had it was like 44-41. Calvin Johnson had 29 points that week. Nate Burleson had 20 fantasy points. And Titus Young had 16. So that was just, a week where everybody went off. But, yeah, I think Titus Young going forward, I think he's a great flex play, fill-in. He's going to be great, I think, for the bye weeks for a lot of people. And, if you traded away a wide receiver and you needed a fill-in, I think he's a guy with just a lot of upside. And, again, if you talk about keeper in dynasty leagues, I think he's a really good guy that you look for in future years. And, again, passing offense. But that's probably enough about the Lions.
Yeah, sure. I do want to point out one more stat about him because I really like this stat.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
He caught 100% of passes thrown his way last week. He was targeted 9 times. He caught all 9 balls. So, so that means he's going to be effective, and Stafford can start to build a rapport of trust with him because he knows he's going to catch the ball. So it's a really good sign for Titus Young. Again, pick him up. He's better than anybody. Their offense is better than any other guys that you'll probably find in your waiver wire.
Right, and I think that's what's crucial about it. So we agree. Titus Young looks good.
Yeah, Titus Young. And, like I said, I was looking at some other guys, just thinking about wide receivers that might be available on your waiver wire. Ours. Brandon LaFell is ranked above Titus Young, Kendall Wright, Cecil Shorts, and Michael Crabtree. The best offense there is Tennessee, and they're 16th. Versus Detroit, which is the second best passing offense in the league. So, while these guys may have better numbers, that's because Titus Young was in a 3-way scenario where one guy and Calvin Johnson's getting pretty much most of the looks, probably getting most of the looks. You could definitely start to trust him more than any of those guys. So, definite good pickup. We can move on from the.
I agree.
Kind of move on.
So, this is a guy that you mentioned that you want to talk about, and I thought that was a great call here. Because I didn't buy into him for the first couple weeks that he did it, and then he's done it again. And Josh Freeman now has gone 3 weeks in a row with 3 touchdown passes. Did it against Kansas City, New Orleans, and Minnesota.
Yes.
Now, none of those are exactly top 10 pass defenses or anything, but that's still really impressive. That offense looks like it's starting to click. Doug Martin has looked really good in recent weeks. He's going to Oakland, San Diego, and Carolina the next 3 weeks. I think he can keep it up. What do you think?
So I actually am going to disagree with that keeping it up, Steve. I think New Orleans and Kansas City are the worst 2 pass defenses in the league. So I don't put a lot of stock in them as far as that. Then the other one is Minnesota, who has had a good defense. And he put up points. So that's one of those weeks that kind of gives me pause because he did put up a big week against them. But before he started this run, he had, for quarterbacks, especially in a league like ours, easily 15 points against the Redskins, who are absolutely the worst pass defense in the league.
My boy.
And I mean, that's not a knock against Redskins fans, but they're the worst pass defense in the league, and he only had 15 points against them. Oakland in our league is allowing the 10th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, but they only allowed 8 points to Matt Ryan, who had 3 interceptions against them. So I will say that while I think Josh Freeman has had a couple big weeks, I don't expect this to stay the same because there's been some mid-level defenses that have really given him some trouble. Carolina is one of those. I think they're the 12th or they're in the low teens, in the mid-teens in pass defense, and they gave him a lot of trouble week one. So I think he's going to go. I don't buy into this hype. I think it wasn't a fluke the one week. He's had a good run against some really bad defenses, and I'm interested to see where he goes. And I'll say how interested I am once we get to our bold predictions. But
okay.
I don't think he doesn't play anyone as bad as the Saints again.
Yeah.
Except when he plays the Saints, which will be in the fantasy playoffs. So if you're worried about quarterback, if you're one of these guys that maybe has a Mike Vick,
me.
Well, if you have a quarterback if you're in a league where you don't have a great quarterback or consistent quarterback, he may be someone good to hang on to if you think you can get into the playoffs. Though with bad quarterback play, I don't know how you would. But you can maybe get in the playoffs and then have a couple good games against some bad teams there too.
Yeah, I mean, he has really connected, and we talked about this a little bit last week with Vincent Jackson, and I think, Vincent Jackson has done more than anybody has really expected him to do this year. I think against Oakland and San Diego and Carolina coming up, I don't think any of those teams scare me. They're all kind of in disarray. I think he's good for a couple weeks, but you raise a good point. When do you use him in fantasy? Ideally, if you're in a 12 to 14 team league, he could be your starter if you drafted somebody like some of those mid-range guys. If you settled back for like an Andy Dalton or Eli Manning, who's had 3 bad weeks, 3 weeks under 14 fantasy points in our league, and that's 6-point touchdown. So Eli's been bad for a couple weeks.
Yep.
But yeah, I think he's a matchup play, and I like his next couple matchups. So again, I think that offense is clicking. I think Doug Martin is coming into the role that they really wanted him to be at the start of the year. I think he's 8 games in now. Well, they've played 7, but they're 8 weeks into the season now, and Doug Martin has looked pretty nice.
Don't get me wrong. I think that there are pieces on that offense that are really surprising this year and are stepping up. I think you mentioned that we talked about Vincent Jackson before. Doug Martin's a top 10 running back in our league, and if you kind of look at his breakdown, he's had a good run these past 3 weeks where they've been doing a lot, 14, 20, and 35 points last week against Minnesota. Good gracious. But, and so Doug Martin has been a big piece. Vincent Jackson's been a big piece to making Josh Freeman success over the past few weeks, which kind of goes into a holistic view of fantasy football even that, you have to look at everything. You can't just look at one guy
right,
to figure it all out. But I'm going to temper any sort of love for Josh Freeman right now because I don't necessarily buy into it yet. If he does it one more week against Oakland, I'll still probably be off, but give me 2 more weeks of these kind of numbers, at least 20 points, and I'll be more bought into him. But again, I do want to I disagree that he's going to be great. I agree that if you can get the right matchup or if you need him in a bad matchup, he's a good play. It's a decent waiver pickup, but I wouldn't.
And the problem with the waiting thing is, if you wait 2 weeks, your usage period for him is pretty much past. I mean, so if you're basically, and we can pretty much end this here in a second, but if you're relying on Josh Freeman, I think you can ride him for a couple more weeks, and I think that's the point. What's interesting though is here are guys that in our league, which again 6-point touchdowns, -3 for turnovers. Josh Freeman has more fantasy points than, and the 2 big names, Matt Stafford and Eli Manning, is who he's ahead of Andrew Dalton, Ryan Fitzpatrick, Andrew Luck, some of those guys. He's a few points behind Ben Roethlisberger, Peyton Manning, and Matt Ryan. Those are the next 3 guys above him. So that's interesting. Again, that's inflated because these last 3 weeks he's had 3 touchdowns and a bunch of yards, which that makes a big difference. He's been over 260 yards in the past 3 weeks. And limited turnovers is the other thing. He's only had one turnover.
That's right. I think that's why he fell so long in drafts, because he had 22 turnovers last year, 22 interceptions
Yeah.
last year, and he's limited that to 5. And that's something that you'll see out of Ben Roethlisberger too this year. Ben Roethlisberger had a lot more interceptions last year, and he's only had 3 on the year. So that's why some of these mid-range quarterbacks are maybe bumping up a little bit higher in points than some of these other guys. Like Eli Manning is at, Eli Manning has 8 interceptions on the year to Ben Roethlisberger, Josh Freeman 8 combined. So. And Eli Manning has less touchdowns than each of those quarterbacks. So, turnovers will play a big role, even when they're only 2 points, whether they're 2 or 3, doesn't really matter. That can play a big role in what your quarterback is doing, and being smart with the ball and being safe with it, is definitely important. I think that's part of the reason why a guy like Cam Newton's not as good this year, because he's just not being safe with the ball.
Yeah, I mean, Cam, I think, was a big disappointment this year, and let's actually go and talk about Cam Newton for a little bit, because he's coming up this week against my team, and unfortunately, I thank you for not leading off the pod with it, but Redskins did not show up this week, and not only that, but they did it again. Your boy Dick LeBeau figured out another rookie, and really put a hurting on he who shall not be named this week, because I agreed if he didn't do it, we wouldn't talk about him. But Cam Newton. So if you're a Cam Newton owner and you can start Cam or Josh Freeman, who are you starting?
That's really tough. And like I said, if you think about the matchups, you've got Oakland giving up the 10th most fantasy points to quarterbacks right now, which seems good, though they've had a decent run. Partially against some bad quarterbacks. They faced Blaine Gabbert recently, but they did hold Matt Ryan to 8 fantasy points. He had 3 interceptions that week.
That's true.
But the Redskins are the worst pass defense in the league.
Yeah.
But it's all about mistakes, and it's all about what kind of mistakes you make. Cam Newton, 5 touchdowns to 8 interceptions. That's just not going to fly. The past 2 weeks he's been 16 and 10 points, and then 6 the week before that. Again, that was Seattle, then Dallas and Chicago. So he's faced some really good defenses recently. He put up 35 against Atlanta in week 4 in a loss. So Cam Newton has the ability to put up good points. He's faced some tough defenses recently. Dallas has crazy corner depth, which you wouldn't know, but that's a matchup that's tough for quarterbacks and wide receivers.
Sure.
Washington's not. So I actually think Cam Newton this week is a good start.
Yeah, I agree, of course. I mean, they're going against my Redskins, so if you can start anybody against the Redskins or against the Saints, or like the Chiefs, you're pretty much going to do that. I think the Bucs have a pretty bad pass defense as well, although their run D is pretty stiff. So yeah, I think this week you probably want to go with Cam Newton over Freeman, just because of the matchup they're playing. The Redskins you can't cover, but look, you nailed it. The big thing with Cam this year is he's not throwing touchdown passes and he's throwing picks. He's making the mistakes. But we all knew, I feel like he wasn't going to get the 14 rushing touchdowns, right? Of course. I mean, we saw that coming, and I think if you were bought into Cam and you just loved him, that didn't matter. But if you were kind of a forward-thinking fantasy owner and you had to draft him, I would not have taken him as one of my top 5 guys per se. I probably would have waited a round or 2 later than most people took him, because look, 14 rushing touchdowns adds so much value to your fantasy score, and you had to know that was going to come down. I mean, that was a record-setting year. His pass yardage dropped off significantly in the second half of the season, and that's kind of what we're seeing here. He's pretty much under 300 yards every week, except for 2. And even then, he's only over, it's like 315 and 303. So he's under 300 yards passing. He's turning it over a couple times a game. And he's averaging 1 touchdown pass per game, a little under 1 touchdown pass per game.
Yeah, and only 3 rushing touchdowns too. So he's averaging a touchdown a game, maybe, and that's rushing and throwing. He's averaging at least a turnover a game, because if you count fumbles too, he's got 11 turnovers this year.
11, yeah.
So I mean, that's a lot of negative points to come out of your quarterback, especially for a guy. 1,700 yards puts him lower end of the totem pole this year in the league. It's just, and it's ball security, and it's just they're not the explosive offense they were last year, and maybe it's partially that people figured him out. His sophomore slump is pretty bad.
Yeah.
There's no doubt in my mind that his sophomore slump is pretty bad, and people were talking about Cam Newton as a first-round pick. Like, this is a guy you need to get in the first round, early second round. You have to have him, and it's just one of those situations where it hasn't played out like you hope. I mean, and I like Cam Newton. I do. I hope that he has a better year, not when I play Sam in our league. Because
right.
But,
right.
I mean, I think it's honestly at this point that you can start thinking about potentially benching Cam Newton. Like, you need to try to pick up another. Maybe you play the matchups with him. If you can pick up him and like Freeman and back and or another maybe mid-round guy. I know Sam has Dalton, who he may also be able to plug in occasionally. Andy Dalton a little bit more consistent than Cam Newton, though. I mean, facing a lot of the same issues, but just more touchdown passes for Andy Dalton because he's got AJ Green, who's a freak.
Well, listen, Dalton's been over 20 points. Is this 4 out of 7 weeks in our league? So Dalton's been really good, and he's had a couple, and he's had 3 of those weeks were over 25 points. Yeah. So when Dalton's on, he's looking good. Cam, again, just the upside is not there as much as it was last year. Here are guys that have scored more than Cam Newton in our league: Joe Flacco, Christian Ponder, Mike Vick, Carson Palmer, Ryan Fitzpatrick, Andrew Luck, Andy Dalton, Alex Smith, and then you get into Manning, Stafford, and Freeman in that group. So he's been really bad this year. I know that's not breaking any news, but I agree. If you're a Newton owner, hopefully you picked up Josh Freeman, or hopefully you got one of those guys like Carson Palmer. Carson Palmer gets a bad rap. He's going to get you around 16 to 20 fantasy points in our league. It's not great, but he's pretty consistent with it.
That's something that you and I preach a lot, and what you can expect from Carson Palmer is absolutely consistency. He's not flashy in any way, and that team's not flashy, but he will be a consistent performer for you. So definitely someone, Carson Palmer is someone to pick up if you have Cam Newton. You're looking for that alternative option. But I do think Cam Newton's a good start this week against Washington, and he's got another few weak teams on his list. He has Kansas City on his list. He's got Tampa Bay the week after. So bad pass defenses. So it's very possible that he could turn it around a little bit.
Yeah.
He put up 26 against New Orleans earlier, only 13 against Tampa Bay earlier, but then 35 against Atlanta, who is a really good team. So I think you can play the matchups with Cam Newton a little bit, but as a regular every week have to start, I don't think it's there. I just don't.
Yeah, I think you're right, and so I think that hurts a lot of people. Obviously, if you're a Cam Newton owner, hopefully by now you've moved on or have looked for another alternative or traded it or something, because he's not a quarterback that's going to take you to the playoffs, and that's what you want to get to. Because, like and I certainly know, as a guy who has made the playoffs 2 years in a row as the 4th seed and both times got to the championship, all you have to do is make the playoffs in fantasy football.
Yeah.
Because anything can happen. Anything can happen. So the goal is make the playoffs and just let the chips fall where they're going to fall, and that's all you can do about it. But yeah, if you're a Cam Newton owner, it's probably a long shot to the playoffs unless you really mitigated that draft with somebody else there.
Yeah, if you've got some other pieces or have another quarterback, that's great. But yeah, just can't bank on him anymore.
So I want your advice, and we'll see.
My advice.
What's that?
I want to give you my advice.
Oh, okay. Well, great. So I mentioned this to you today. Yeah, sick tattoo. That's so usually when I talk, Jimmy is showing me various body parts. He has a sweet tattoo. It looks great. So I was thinking, and I was talking to you about this today very briefly, about basically trading. Essentially, I have a trade that I proposed. That essentially is like a Darren McFadden for Ryan Matthews trade.
Yep.
Some other pieces in there, but that's what it boils down to. The extra is extra. And I understand the guy who owns Ryan Matthews in our league, really hard time about it. So your opinion on Ryan Matthews versus Darren McFadden, and I want to hear what you think about their values going forward the rest of the
Absolutely. I think Ryan Matthews and Darren McFadden, in my opinion, for like the here's my hypothesis. They're relatively the same player right now, as far as it goes. You'll see a point differential between Darren McFadden and Ryan Matthews. It's because Ryan Matthews missed the first few weeks of the season, so he wasn't even a factor the first few weeks.
First 2 weeks, yeah.
Yeah, the first 2 weeks, absolutely no points. He came back, has been in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks he's played. He's been under 10 points in 3 of those 5. Then he had a 23-point week and an 11-point week. I don't think Ryan Matthews is quite living up to the hype this year. I'm a notorious Ryan Matthews hater this year.
Yeah.
I think Darren McFadden also is not, but partially because the team is bad. I think McFadden, he's been a little bit better, but I also still think Oakland is bad and isn't going to go anywhere. So I kind of consider those two guys about the same. I think if Ryan Matthews would have played the first 2 weeks, they'd have similar point totals right now.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think they're pretty close. I think probably Darren McFadden has the higher upside because when we've seen Darren McFadden at his best, he's been like a top 3 back, right? When he was healthy and was running and looking great, he was great. Ryan Matthews has had that one good season. They both had injury issues, so that's kind of a wash for me. Yeah. And my big thing against Ryan Matthews is just that that offense in San Diego is just so bad. You know, they scored like 6 points against the Browns.
That's true.
It's just terrible. So, and I agree. I think they're pretty close. And essentially, the nuts and bolts of the trade is I need a backup quarterback because I'm starting Vic. I traded away Stafford. I'm starting Vic. Obviously, Vic is just a wild card. I don't want to leverage the rest of my season on Vic, so I want a guy that I can kind of fill in there. But I agree. I think they're about similar. I think McFadden probably has the higher upside. I talked myself into doing it because I can start Jonathan Stewart this week at a flex spot against, again, the Redskins. Jonathan Dwyer just ran for over 100 against the Skins, so I think Jonathan Stewart could probably do some damage there.
We shall see. Yahoo is telling me McFadden broke the 100-yard rushing barrier only the second time this season.
Right.
And he hasn't scored in 5 out of the last 7 games. So, yeah, I think McFadden does have the higher upside just because we have seen him be more explosive and he's a bigger back. They're both – I don't trust either of them. I think they're pretty much equal. That's my –
I agree.
If for a backup quarterback and that's all you have to give up, then that and maybe another piece, you're probably okay.
Yeah. All right, let's do it. Let's recap. Let's recap our bold predictions. And
oh my gosh, the Chex Mix Bold Party Mix predictions from last week.
That's it.
Raw predicted.
So I said this is timely because I said Darren McFadden would have 18 fantasy points.
That's
now
right.
It was funny because the guys in our league gave me a hard time because they said, okay, that's not really a bold prediction. 18 fantasy points is like you kind of hope that for your running back. And I had to remind them Darren McFadden had not been running that well.
18 is his top this year.
Yeah, right, yeah. He had 15 points, so I was close. I didn't nail it, but again, you know me, I'm going to count that as a win.
Of course you are. Mine, I am not even in any way, shape, or form close to a win. I predicted Josh Gordon of the Cleveland Browns to be over 20 points this week because he's been catching touchdowns, so on and so forth. Josh Gordon had 6 points in our league, so I was well off of my mark of 20 points for him. So a disappointing prediction week for me, but that's okay. I'm pretty used to it at this point.
And I think the crux of your argument is if you're going to own a Cleveland Brown wide receiver, Josh Gordon is still the guy that you want. Sure. I mean, that was an ugly game against San Diego, very low scoring, not a whole lot going on. He still averaged 15 yards per catch. He's the guy that you want. He's been catching those long touchdowns in 3 of the last 4 weeks, right? Sure. And I think you're right. Going forward, if anyone on that team as a wide receiver is going to get is going to have a 20-point week, rather, it's going to be Josh Gordon.
That's true, and I mean 6 points isn't the worst for a flex play wide receiver. You hope for more. Luckily, I was still able to win from some other big pieces, but completely right. Josh Gordon is the receiver to own from the Browns if you have to have a Browns receiver.
Definitely.
So predictions this week, AJ. I hear through the grapevine that you were preparing your prediction this week.
I prepared some predictions this week because we're recording. Well, we're recording on a Wednesday rather than a Tuesday, and so for some reason that extra day made me take some time. So I have a couple. I have a couple, but I'll start with I'll start with my official one, and again, it kind of stays in the same thread that we were just talking about because it's been on my mind. But I think Ryan Matthews this week, he's running against Kansas City. They're running on Thursday night, and you know my aversion to Thursday night games because it's going to be, it's a short week. Neither team has time to prepare. I think Kansas City's defense will suffer more than San Diego's offense will for the short week in terms of not being as prepared. I just think the organization – listen, their head coach, when asked why Jamal Charles had 5 carries, was like, yeah, I'm not really sure why. We should probably fix that, shouldn't we? It's like,
yeah, that's a problem.
That's your job. Like, you are the one responsible for that. Why do you not know that? So I just think that organization is a nightmare. And so I think Ryan Matthews has a really good week. I think he has one of his kind of high weeks rather than one of his low weeks. I just think the Chiefs, that defense is just going to be really bad. So I'm going to go big. I'm going to go a 25-point week for Ryan Matthews this week. I don't think that'll be his average for the rest of the way, but I just think he's got a bad defense. They're on a short week, going to pound the ball again. And so I could see him finding the end zone for the second time this year.
I like it. I think that's pretty bold, given 23 is his max so far this year, and he's had a lot of single-digit games. So I'll give you bold on that one. Again, I think that's for starting running back. That's kind of what you hope for every week. But
yeah.
What can you say when it comes to the NFL and running backs this year? We can't all own Arian Foster. My prediction this week is actually going to go negative towards a player. So
I like this.
Yeah. So circling back to what we had talked about before, I actually play against Josh Freeman this week. It's a Tom Brady bye-week fill-in for TJB, who is starting Josh Freeman this week so far. And I am going to predict under 12 points for Josh Freeman this week.
All right.
This is my bold prediction. I think it's going to be less than 12 points. I don't even remember off the top of my head who they play. Oakland is who they play at this point. I think it's going to be one of two things. I think either Doug Martin's going to go completely off and have a huge game, and they'll be able to run the ball because they'll get up a little bit through their run game, or just Oakland shuts him down like they did to Matt Ryan. I think the Bucs have been riding high, and I think it's time for them to crash down to earth a little bit and maybe have to crash a victory formation again. So I
like going negative on a guy.
Yeah, I sub 12 points for Josh Freeman this week.
Cool.
Is my prediction.
I think another sneaky one here for defense special teams play, which is kind of we rarely talk about, or at least at length. I actually really like the New York Giants defense against the Steelers this week, and I'll tell you why. Because your patchwork offensive line going against OC and Tuck and Jason Pierre-Paul, I just think they're due for a big day of sacks, and that tends to lead to turnovers. So I could see Ben struggling a little bit if they get a lot of pressure on him. And so I think if you're looking, like I have San Francisco, I was going to try to nab the Giants in our league, and I missed out on them. But I think they could put a lot of pressure on Ben, and I could think that could lead to sacks and turnovers, which that's what you want from your D. So that's another little sneaky one. And I might add that caveat of a 15-point day at least for the Giants defense, which maybe isn't too bold, but whatever.
I think 15 points for a defense is a pretty good day for any defense. We can't all have Nord's voodoo magic of 25-point defenses every week.
The dude starts the Texans, and they just score 25 points a week, and then on their bye week he starts the Dolphins.
Yes,
and they have like 25
9 points.
It's voodoo magic, Jimmy. It's voodoo magic. It's unnecessary.
Sold his soul to the stripper devil.
It's illegitimate. Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
All right, so I think that's going to wrap us up for this week. We've made some bold predictions. We'll be back again next week. Regular day, I hope, next week, but we'll have to see.
Yes.
Players, just keep an eye out for the podcast. Keep an eye out for us. We'll be around, and we'll hit all your feeds as we need to. All right.
A pleasure as always.
Nice.